chosen. 1. There is a reason your life became quiet, and it did not happen by accident. There is a reason people disappeared without explanation. Conversations faded, invitations stopped, and familiar energies could no longer reach you. There is a reason the attacks ended suddenly, almost unnaturally. Yet the loneliness remained like a lingering echo. What you survived was not ordinary opposition, and what you walked through was not random rejection or bad timing. You were surrounded, energetically, spiritually, emotionally, by a coordinated resistance that operated beneath the surface, a pressure you were never meant to see with your physical eyes, only feel with your spirit. And yet, through all of it, you are still here, standing, breathing, aware. They did not retreat because you argued louder, proved yourself, or fought harder in the visible world. They retreated because you were protected in ways that cannot be explained logically. Before we continue, if this message resonates with your spirit, comment, "I am chosen," like this video, and subscribe, because this channel speaks to those who are spiritually marked and divinely preserved. Chosen. 1. Many of you have been asking the same quiet question deep in your heart, often in moments of silence when there is no one left to ask it out loud. Why am I so alone, especially now? Not after failure, not after wrongdoing, not after falling off your path, but after growth, after clarity, after awakening. After you finally saw things clearly, spoke less, reacted less, and understood more. The truth is this: your loneliness is not abandonment, it is containment. When a soul carries spiritual authority, separation becomes a form of protection. What feels like isolation is actually divine quarantine. You were not being punished, you were being preserved. You did not lose people because you were unworthy. You were removed from reach because access to you became dangerous to the mission you carry. Certain energies can no longer touch you without consequence, and certain people cannot stay without being exposed by your presence. This is why the noise stopped. This is why the chaos faded. This is why even those who once opposed you seem distant or irrelevant now. Your spirit has entered a protected perimeter. In this phase, God reduces external interference so internal alignment can stabilize. You're being recalibrated, strengthened, and sealed. The loneliness you feel is the echo of old attachments dissolving, not a sign that something is wrong. It is the space required for authority to settle into your identity. This is where discernment sharpens, intuition deepens, and your spirit learns to stand without leaning. Many never reach this stage because they confuse silence with failure and isolation with rejection. But you are still here because you were chosen to pass through it consciously. You didn't lose your tribe. You outgrew the environment that once held you. And now, in this quiet, something greater is forming. Now let's dive deeper. Point 1. Why you were targeted without being warned. Chosen. 1. You were never meant to be informed ahead of time about what was forming around you, because foreknowledge would have altered your posture. And posture is everything when pressure is being assembled in silence. If you had known, you might have braced yourself too early, tightened your emotional field, or moved from instinct into calculation. That shift alone would have made you predictable. Instead, you were allowed to remain yourself, calm, observant, neutral, and internally aligned. This matters deeply on a psychological level, because people who move through intuition rather than fear are almost impossible to manipulate. Fear creates urgency, urgency creates mistakes, and mistakes create access points for control. You denied all three without effort. That is why pressure rarely comes alone. It does not arrive as a single confrontation. It gathers slowly. It consolidates quietly. It forms unspoken agreements among those who feel threatened but cannot name why. You were not targeted because you announced strength, dominance, or authority. You were targeted because your presence disrupted invisible emotional economies. You did not mirror insecurity. You did not over-explain yourself. You did not chase belonging. You did not absorb projections that were never yours to carry. Your nervous system stayed regulated while others depended on chaos for relevance. And when people cannot read your inner world, they grow uncomfortable. When they cannot predict your reactions, they lose leverage. When they lose leverage, they attempt to control the environment instead of the individual. This is where coordination forms. Not through hatred, but through shared discomfort. Not through strategy, but through instinctive resistance to what cannot be dominated. What they labeled as distance was not avoidance. It was sovereignty. You were self-contained. You were not emotionally negotiable. You did not need permission to exist as you were. And sovereignty is destabilizing to systems built on emotional dependency, hierarchy, and unspoken power games. Your neutrality collapsed narratives. Your silence exposed agendas. Your consistency highlighted inconsistency in others. That is why escalation followed. Not because you provoked conflict, but because your presence removed the illusion of control. You became a mirror without trying to be one. You became a fixed point in a shifting system. And systems always attempt to eliminate what they cannot absorb. What formed around you was not punishment. It was proof. Proof that you had outgrown environments that required you to be smaller, louder, or more reactive to be understood. Point 2. Why it felt like a one-man army. Chosen one, when divine protection is active, assistance rarely looks human, and this is the part most people misunderstand while they are inside the process. You felt unsupported not because you were forgotten, but because you were being shielded in a way that forces internal strength to emerge. Psychologically, the human mind is wired to expect safety through visible allies, validation, and reassurance. Spiritually, however, protection often works by removing witnesses, removing applause, and removing backup so that dependency dissolves. You were not abandoned. You were trained. You were placed in silence so discernment could sharpen. You were placed in isolation so intuition could grow louder than external noise. When no one claps for you, you learn to move without permission. When no one defends you, you learn to stand without explanation. This phase creates someone who does not collapse when support disappears, because their center is no longer external. A one-man army is not someone who is aggressive, loud, or constantly fighting opposition. A one-man army is someone who no longer requires agreement, validation, or emotional reinforcement to move forward. The opposition expected emotional reactions. They expected you to argue, to defend, to panic, and to explain yourself into exhaustion. They expected confusion, because confusion is what they rely on to gain leverage. Instead, they encountered composure. You did not react. You did not plead your case. You did not chase clarity from people who thrive on distortion, and that unsettled them. Silence from an ungrounded person feels like weakness, but silence from a grounded individual feels like dominance to those who rely on chaos to feel powerful. Your calm disrupted their strategy. Your restraint dismantled their narrative. When you stop explaining yourself, manipulators lose their grip because explanation is the doorway they enter through. Divine protection does not always block attacks. Sometimes it drains the attacker of relevance. It removes their access to your energy by strengthening your self-containment. This is why you felt alone, but became unshakable. This is why you were isolated, but not broken. You were being recalibrated to operate without emotional dependence. What they interpreted as withdrawal was actually mastery. What they assumed was weakness was discipline. You were not surviving, you were stabilizing. And now, when pressure appears, you do not scatter. When accusations arise, you do not rush to defend. When silence surrounds you, you do not fear it, because divine protection has already completed its work. Point 3. Why they withdrew without closure. Chosen one. One of the most unsettling realities for the opposition was that there was no dramatic confrontation, no explosive ending, and no final argument they could point to and say, "This is where we won." There was no visible defeat they could replay in their minds. Psychologically, this absence is deeply disturbing for anyone who survives on narrative control, because they needed a clean story where you were wrong, unstable, emotional, or broken. They needed an ending that justified their behavior and validated their self-image. Instead, what they received was silence, distance, and unresolved ambiguity. And ambiguity is unbearable for insecure minds. When there is no conclusion, the mind loops endlessly, searching for meaning, replaying moments, questioning motives, and filling the gaps with fear. They expected chaos, but you gave composure. They expected reaction, but you gave restraint. And that calm did something far more powerful than confrontation ever could. Your presence became a mirror, not a distorted one that flatters or excuses, but a clear surface reflecting back their intentions, insecurities, and contradictions. When people are forced to see themselves without filters, without someone else absorbing their projections, discomfort sets in. This is why they withdrew. Not because you chased them away, not because you fought harder, but because staying close to you exposed what they were trying to avoid within themselves. Your steadiness removed their camouflage. Your silence denied them feedback. Your emotional neutrality cut off their supply. This is also why the attacks stopped suddenly. Not gradually, not after apologies or resolutions, but abruptly. The intention never truly disappeared. What disappeared was access. You were no longer reachable energetically. You no longer engaged in the emotional exchanges that allowed influence to flow. And when influence ends, fear begins. Fear of irrelevance, fear of exposure, fear of losing control over the story they tell themselves and others. In this phase, distance becomes your protection. Not isolation, but alignment. You didn't need to announce boundaries because your energy enforced them. You didn't need to explain yourself because clarity doesn't argue. This is the quiet authority of the chosen one. Transformation without spectacle. Victory without witnesses, and power without noise. Those who could not stand in that presence removed themselves, and in doing so, revealed the truth without you saying a word. Point 4. Why loneliness is part of divine protection. Chosen one. Isolation is not absence, it is insulation, and this distinction matters more than most people realize. When a system is being refined, interference must be reduced, not because the system is weak, but because it's becoming precise. This applies to your mind, your emotions, your spirit, and even your physical energy. You were not separated because you lacked value. You were separated because too many people had access to you without accountability for your well-being. Too many eyes were watching, too many mouths were taking, and too many expectations were pulling at you without offering stability in return. You were being reacted to instead of supported, observed instead of protected, and measured instead of understood. Isolation created space, and space is not emptiness. Space is a controlled environment. In that environment, recalibration occurs. Your nervous system, once overstimulated by chaos, opinions, and emotional volatility, began to settle. Your body learned safety again. Your mind slowed down enough to hear itself think. Your intuition, once drowned out by noise, sharpened because it no longer had to compete for attention. Emotional reactions that once fired automatically began to soften, not because you stopped feeling, but because you gained regulation. This is how clarity is formed, not through constant interaction, but through intentional stillness. This phase was never punishment. Punishment drains. Preparation strengthens. You were removed from noise so your internal guidance could become unmistakable. When external voices fade, the inner compass grows louder. That quiet awareness you now feel, the calm that exists alongside the loneliness, is not a contradiction. It is confirmation. Peace and solitude together signal protection, not abandonment. This is the phase where discernment replaces people-pleasing, where boundaries become instinctual rather than forced, and where your energy stops leaking into environments that cannot hold it. You are learning what alignment feels like in your body, not just what it sounds like in theory. That sense of being alone but not unsafe, isolated but not empty, is evidence that something is being preserved within you. Systems that matter are shielded during refinement, not exposed. And when the insulation is no longer needed, it will lift naturally. Not to return you to chaos, but to reintroduce you into connection with clarity, strength, and self-trust, fully intact. Point 5. Why you no longer recognize your old self. Chosen one, growth often feels like grief because you are leaving behind versions of yourself that survived rather than thrived. Versions that learn to cope, appease, shrink, or harden, just to make it through environments that were never designed to honor your essence. And the nervous system remembers those versions even when the soul no longer needs them. Which is why the silence can feel heavy, and the solitude can ache. Not because something is wrong, but because something is finally integrating. You no longer respond to provocation because your mind has learned that chaos does not deserve a reply. And your body has learned that safety no longer requires performance. You no longer over-explain because clarity has replaced defensiveness, and when truth is rooted, it does not beg to be validated. You no longer seek to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding you, because awareness has shown you that some people do not listen to connect. They listen to extract, distort, or control. Psychologically, this marks a transition from a reactive identity shaped by threat and approval into an integrated identity anchored in self-trust and coherence. You are no longer fragmented across roles, masks, and emotional negotiations. You are whole, and wholeness carries a quiet authority that cannot be manipulated. This is why it feels threatening to those who rely on emotional hooks, drama, or instability to feel relevant in your life. Your presence no longer feeds their patterns. This is why conversations feel shallow now, because you are no longer speaking from wounds, but from awareness. This is why environments feel heavy, because your nervous system can now sense misalignment instantly. You did not become cold. You became regulated. You did not become superior. You became aligned. And alignment is not loud, aggressive, or performative. Alignment is clean, selective, and uncompromising in its truth. It naturally excludes distortion, not as punishment, but as a consequence. What cannot resonate with truth will quietly fall away, and what remains will meet you where you are, whole, grounded, and no longer available for anything less. Point 6. What this season is quietly building. Chosen 1. Nothing in this season is wasted, even though the surface appears quiet and unchanged, because beneath what looks like stillness, momentum is assembling with precision. This is not a pause, it is a calibration. While the world measures progress by noise and motion, your growth has been occurring internally, where the most permanent transformations take place. Boundaries are no longer something you rehearse or explain. They are solidifying into instinct. You no longer argue with your intuition. You move with it. Discernment is sharpening to the point where you sense misalignment before it speaks, and emotional self-regulation is becoming natural rather than biased. What once triggered reactions now barely registers, not because you are numb, but because you are anchored. You are being trained for connection without entanglement, the ability to engage deeply without losing yourself, and to care without carrying what is not yours. You are being shaped for influence without absorption, where others feel your presence without draining your energy, and for leadership without force, where authority flows from stability rather than control. The next phase of your life will not ask you to prove your worth, explain your journey, or convince anyone of your value. It will ask something far more demanding, that you remain grounded while everything accelerates. This is why you were trained in silence. This is why attention was removed before it was returned. Silence taught you how to listen inwardly, how to move without validation, and how to stand alone without collapsing. So, when visibility returns, it does not intoxicate you. When opportunity expands, it does not destabilize you. When others project expectations onto you, you do not bend to meet them. You stand rooted, clear, and composed, knowing that this season was not an absence of progress, but the quiet construction of strength that cannot be shaken. Point 7. Final integration and confirmation. Chosen 1, if you feel calm after chaos, this message is confirming what you already sensed deep within you. That calm is not weakness, it is not numbness, it is not avoidance. It is evidence that your nervous system, your spirit, and your awareness have completed a cycle. You were never under attack in the way your mind once believed. What you experienced was not destruction, but insulation. You were under protection in a way you could not yet recognize, because protection does not always feel gentle while it is happening. Sometimes it feels like isolation. Sometimes it feels like loss. Sometimes it feels like being misunderstood by everyone you once trusted. But protection works quietly, removing threats by removing access, not by creating noise. The loneliness you endured was not punishment. It was strategic. It was designed to pull you out of environments where your energy was being drained, distorted, or studied by those who could not walk with you into your next level. The separation was surgical, precise, and intentional, cutting cords without damaging your core. And the silence you were placed in was instructional. In silence, you stopped reacting. In silence, you learned discernment. In silence, you learned how to observe without explaining, how to remain steady without defending, and how to exist without broadcasting your next move. You did not defeat opposition through confrontation, arguments, or force. You defeated it by becoming unreachable. You outgrew access, and when access ends, influence dissolves completely. Those who once had power over your emotions, your focus, or your direction now feel distant, irrelevant, and strangely small. That is not arrogance, that is clarity. This calm you feel now is stabilization. It is your system returning to balance after prolonged pressure. It is the signal that your internal alignment has caught up with your external reality. This is not the end of your story, and it is not the peak. It is the pause before expansion. Remain grounded, because grounding keeps power clean. Remain observant, because awareness protects what force cannot. Remain aligned, because alignment multiplies effort without strain. Your season is shifting quietly, without announcements, without validation, without applause. But it is shifting powerfully, in ways that cannot be reversed. And once a shift like this locks in, life no longer tests you the same way again.